The first call came while I was standing beside the President of the United States. The second came 30 seconds later, then a third, then a fourth. By the time the ceremony ended, my phone showed 12 missed calls from my father. My father. The same man who had laughed when I asked him to attend this event. The same man who said he wasn't driving 4 hours for my little army ceremony. The same man who hadn't attended one meaningful milestone in my life for almost 20 years. I remember looking down at the screen and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just disbelief. Because for most of my life, getting my father's attention had been harder than getting military approval for $1 million program. Yet here he was, calling over and over again, wanting something, wanting me. What he didn't know was that I wasn't planning to come home alone. But before I tell you about that, I need to go back 2 months. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 42 years old. I'm a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel divorced, and currently the Director of Veteran Services for a nonprofit organization in Virginia. I live alone in a small townhouse about 30 minutes outside Richmond. The place isn't impressive. A brick exterior, a modest yard, a few flower beds I constantly forget to water. After 22 years in the Army, simplicity feels like luxury, the silence especially. Most days I enjoy it, but sometimes silence has a way of reminding you who isn't calling. My father, Frank Mitchell, lives in western Pennsylvania with my mother, Linda. My younger brother, Jason, lives nearby. Growing up, Jason was the center of gravity in our family. Everything somehow orbited around him. He was outgoing, popular, confident. The kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone laugh within 5 minutes. I was different, more reserved, more focused, more comfortable with responsibility than attention. Dad always admired Jason's personality. He respected my reliability. Those sound similar. They're not. One earns applause. The other earns expectations. Over time, that difference became the story of our family. When Jason started a business, Dad called everyone he knew. When I made major rank promotions in the Army, Dad usually forgot the dates. When Jason bought a new truck, Dad wanted photos. When I deployed overseas, Dad asked how long I'd be gone. Not because he was cruel, because he genuinely didn't understand what my work meant. And people rarely celebrate what they don't understand. 2 months before the ceremony, I called my parents on a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table with paperwork spread around me. The nonprofit where I worked had nominated me for a national recognition event, honoring veterans who had created impactful programs for military families. I didn't expect to win anything. Honestly, I was surprised to be invited. But it mattered to me. The work mattered. For the last 7 years, my team had helped wounded veterans and struggling military families navigate housing, healthcare, employment, and mental health services. We had helped thousands of people, not because we were extraordinary, because people needed help, and because someone should show up. When Mom answered, she sounded happy to hear from me. We talked about weather, about her garden, about a neighbor's new puppy. Then Dad got on the phone. I told them about the ceremony. I explained that it would be held in Washington. I told them I'd love for them to come. There was a brief silence. Then Dad laughed. Actually laughed. I remember every second of it. Not because it was loud. Because it was dismissive. "Sarah," he said. "Yeah. We're not driving 4 hours for your little Army ceremony." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were especially cruel. Because they were familiar. I heard Jason laughing in the background. Then his voice came through the phone. "Dad's right." I closed my eyes. Jason continued. "No offense, sis, but nobody wants to spend an entire day listening to military speeches." Mom immediately tried to soften things. "Frank." But Dad wasn't finished. "You've been doing Army stuff your whole life." I almost corrected him. Retired officers generally don't call it Army stuff. But there didn't seem much point. Dad continued. "We'll see you at Thanksgiving." As if that settled everything. As if the invitation itself had been unreasonable. I looked around my empty kitchen. At the paperwork. At the ceremony information packet. At the years behind it. 22 years of service. Deployments. Missed holidays. Missed birthdays. A marriage that couldn't survive the constant relocations and absences. Thousands of veterans helped after retirement. And somehow all of it could be summarized as Army stuff. I could hear Mom trying to rescue the conversation. But I was already emotionally stepping away from it. "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to come." Dad sounded relieved. "Good." Then he changed the subject entirely. Jason's newest business project. A commercial property. Some investment opportunity. I don't remember the details. I only remember realizing that my ceremony was over before the conversation had truly begun. That evening after the call ended, I sat on my back patio and watched the sun go down. The disappointment surprised me. At 42, I thought I was past needing my father's approval. Maybe I was. But approval isn't the same thing as presence. What hurt wasn't that he wasn't proud. What hurt was that he wasn't interested. For a long time, I sat there listening to the distant sounds of traffic and thinking about all the moments my parents had missed. Army graduations, promotion ceremonies, retirement events, recognition dinners, years of my life. And yet I still made the call, still sent the invitation, still hoped. I should have known better. But hope has a way of surviving longer than common sense. At the time, I thought the conversation was over. I thought my parents had made their choice. I had no idea that 2 months later my photograph would appear on a giant screen beside the president. And suddenly my father wouldn't be able to stop calling. For the next few weeks I tried not to think about the ceremony. Work helped. Work almost always helped. At our nonprofit there was never a shortage of problems that needed solving. A veteran facing eviction. A military spouse trying to find childcare. A family struggling to navigate disability benefits after a service-related injury. Real problems have a way of shrinking personal disappointments, at least temporarily. Most mornings I arrived before 8. Most evenings I left after 6. The days filled themselves, but every now and then, usually during the quiet moments, my father's words would come back. Your little army ceremony. Not because the phrase was especially harsh, because it revealed something. A person doesn't dismiss 22 years of someone's life by accident. They dismiss it because they never truly understood it in the first place. One Saturday afternoon, I drove to Pennsylvania to visit my parents. Not because they invited me. Because Mom had mentioned she was making her famous chicken pot pie. Some traditions are stronger than hurt feelings. When I pulled into the driveway, Jason's new SUV was already there. That wasn't surprising. Jason was around often. He lived only 15 minutes away. Dad loved that. Dad had always loved proximity. Jason's life was visible. Mine wasn't. Jason could stop by after work. I had spent most of my adult life stationed in different states and occasionally different countries. It's difficult to compete with geography. Inside, everything felt familiar. The smell of coffee, the old clock in the hallway, the photographs lining the walls, mostly family pictures, graduations, vacations, birthdays. I noticed something I'd seen before but never really counted. There were 23 framed photographs in the hallway. Only 2 included me. Both were more than 10 years old. Mom hugged me tightly when I walked in. Dad gave me a quick smile. Jason was already talking. He was always talking. That afternoon's topic was a commercial property investment. Apparently it was going to change everything. I had heard variations of that sentence for 20 years. When lunch was finished, Dad leaned back in his chair. You should look at what Jason's doing. Jason grinned. There's real money in this one. I smiled politely. I'm happy with what I'm doing. Dad shook his head. I know, but you've always worked too hard. The irony almost made me laugh. 22 years in the Army. Countless deployments. Years helping veterans after retirement. And somehow the criticism was that I worked too hard. Jason jumped in. You know what your problem is? Here we go. I looked at him. What? You never learned how to market yourself. Dad immediately nodded. Exactly. I sat there quietly. Jason continued. People have no idea what you do. That part was true. Then he added, and honestly, if nobody knows, does it really matter? The room went silent for a moment. Not because he intended to be cruel. Because he genuinely believed what he was saying. Visibility equaled value. Recognition equaled success. Applause equaled importance. The strange thing was that I used to believe that too. Until I started meeting veterans whose lives had been shattered by war. Men and women whose names would never appear in newspapers. People who quietly rebuilt their lives every day without public recognition. They taught me something. The most important work is often invisible. That afternoon I left earlier than planned. Not angry. Just tired. Again. A few days later I attended a meeting in Washington regarding the upcoming recognition event. There were roughly 30 nominees from across the country. Different branches. Different organizations. Different stories. During a break I found myself sitting beside a retired Marine named Walter Jenkins. He looked to be in his late 70s. Sharp eyes. Weathered face. The kind of man who seemed impossible to surprise. We talked for a while. Eventually, he asked whether my family planned to attend. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was easier than explaining. No. He nodded, as if he'd heard that answer before. That happens more than people think. I looked at him. What does families understanding sacrifice only after someone else points it out? Those words stayed with me, because they felt true. Not just for military families, for all families. Sometimes the people closest to us become so accustomed to our contributions that they stop seeing them. A few weeks later, Mom called. We talked for nearly an hour. Near the end of the conversation, she asked about the ceremony. For the first time, she sounded genuinely curious. Will there be many people there? A few hundred. Oh, and some government officials. Another pause. Then, your father still doesn't really understand what it's for. I smiled sadly. I know. Mom hesitated, then said something that caught me off guard. I don't think he's ever understood what you sacrificed. That was different. Usually Mom defended him, explained him, softened his rough edges. This time she simply sounded disappointed. I didn't know how to respond, so neither of us said much for a few seconds. Then Mom quietly added, When you were deployed, I used to worry every day. I swallowed. We rarely talked about those years. I know. No, she said softly. I don't think you do. For a moment her voice sounded older, tired, almost regretful. I should have said it more. The conversation stayed with me long after we hung up, because recognition wasn't really what I wanted. Not from the ceremony, not from my parents. What I wanted was understanding, and those are not the same thing. The ceremony was now only 3 weeks away. My parents still weren't coming. Jason was busy. Dad wasn't interested. Life would continue exactly as expected. At least that's what I believed. What I didn't know was that the event itself was about to become much bigger than anyone had anticipated, and that a single photograph would soon force my entire family to see me differently, whether they wanted to or not. The morning of the ceremony started like most important days in my life. Quietly. No fanfare. No crowd of family members wishing me luck. No emotional send-off. Just me, a hotel room in Washington, D.C., and a cup of coffee that was far too hot to drink. I stood by the window watching the city wake up below me. Traffic slowly filling the streets. People hurrying toward offices. Tourists gathering near monuments. Ordinary life continuing as if nothing special was about to happen. Which honestly was how I preferred it. I had never been comfortable with attention. One of the strange realities of military service is that most meaningful work happens behind the scenes. You learn quickly that success is usually measured by outcomes, not applause. That's one reason I enjoyed my work with veterans after retirement. It felt familiar. The focus stayed where it belonged, on helping people, not promoting yourself. The ceremony itself was being held at a large conference center near Arlington. When I arrived, the lobby was already crowded. Veterans, military families, nonprofit leaders, government officials, people greeting old friends they hadn't seen in years. I checked in and found my assigned seat. Then I settled in for what I assumed would be a long but meaningful day. Nothing more, nothing less. The first few hours unfolded exactly as expected. Speeches, awards, recognition of various programs helping military families. I listened carefully. Some of the stories were remarkable. A Navy veteran creating housing initiatives. A military spouse building support networks for caregivers. A retired Air Force officer helping homeless veterans find employment. People doing extraordinary work without seeking recognition. The kind of people I admired most. By lunchtime, I was actually enjoying myself. Not because of the attention. Because I felt surrounded by people who understood service. People who didn't need explanations. Then shortly after lunch, everything changed. One of the event organizers approached our table. She looked excited and slightly nervous. There's been a schedule update. Several of us exchanged curious looks. A special guest will be joining us this afternoon. Nobody thought much of it. Washington is full of special guests. Cabinet members, senators, military leaders, that sort of thing. Then she added, the president will be attending. The entire room went silent. For a moment I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Within minutes, security personnel appeared throughout the building. Schedules shifted. Instructions changed. The atmosphere transformed completely. Even then, I still didn't think much about it personally. The president wasn't there for me. He was there for the event, for the veterans, for the organizations being recognized. I was simply one person among many. A few hours later, the ceremony resumed. The president arrived. The audience stood. Applause filled the room. The speech itself was thoughtful, respectful, focused on service, sacrifice, and community. Nothing political, just appreciation. The kind of message people from every background could understand. Then came the awards portion, and suddenly my name appeared on the screen. I felt my stomach tighten. Not from fear, from surprise. A video began playing. Photographs, interviews, stories from veterans and military families. Stories I had never heard before. People describing moments I barely remembered. A housing crisis solved. A family reunited. A wounded veteran finding stability again. The work had always felt ordinary to me. Seeing it through someone else's eyes was unsettling. In a good way. Then the narrator said something that nearly brought me to tears. Sometimes the people who change lives the most are the people nobody notices. The room applauded. I sat completely still, unable to process any of it. When the video ended, I was invited to the stage. The president shook my hand. We spoke briefly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing historic. Just a sincere conversation about veterans and families. Then a photographer captured the moment. One photograph. A few seconds. That was all. The event continued. More awards. More speeches. More stories. By late afternoon, I was emotionally exhausted. In the best possible way. As people began leaving, my phone buzzed. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. And again. Eventually, I looked down. Dad. I frowned. Then I saw another missed call. Jason. Another. Dad. Another. Mom. More followed. I stared at the screen, confused. Then one of my colleagues approached. She was smiling. You're everywhere. What? She held up her phone. The photograph. Me standing beside the president. It had already been posted by several veteran organizations, military publications, regional news outlets, social media accounts. Apparently the image was spreading faster than I realized. I laughed softly. Not because it felt important. Because it felt absurd. For years my family had shown almost no interest in my work. Now a photograph existed. Suddenly everyone was paying attention. By the time I returned to the hotel, I had 12 missed calls. 5 from Dad. 3 from Jason. 4 from Mom. A text message waited at the top of my screen. Dad, why didn't you tell us this was such a big deal? I stared at the message. Then laughed again. Not cruelly. Not bitterly. Just honestly. Because I had told them. 2 months earlier. When I invited them. A second message arrived. This one from Jason. My business partners just showed me your photo. Call me. The irony was almost overwhelming. For years my accomplishments had been invisible. Not because they were hidden. Because nobody was looking. Now strangers were paying attention. And suddenly my family wanted front row seats. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at the growing number of notifications. Messages from former soldiers, veterans, co-workers, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Most of them weren't congratulating me for standing beside the president. They were thanking me for the work. The actual work. The lives behind the photograph. And that meant far more. Outside my hotel window, Washington glowed beneath the evening lights. Inside, my phone rang again. Mom this time. I watched it vibrate across the nightstand. Then stop. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. I pressed play. Her voice sounded emotional. Much more emotional than I expected. Sarah? A pause. Then, we need to talk. And for the first time in a very long time, I suspected my family was finally ready to listen. I didn't call my mother back that night. Not because I was angry. And not because I wanted to make anyone wait. The truth was simpler. For the first time in years, I wanted to think before I reacted. For most of my life, I had responded immediately whenever my family needed something. A phone call. A favor. A crisis. A problem. I showed up. That pattern becomes automatic after enough years. You stop asking whether people value your presence. You simply assume responsibility. But sitting in that hotel room looking at 12 missed calls from people who had declined my invitation 2 months earlier, I realized something uncomfortable. They were reaching out because they had seen a photograph. Not because they had finally discovered who I was. That difference mattered. The next morning I drove back to Virginia. The ceremony was over. The excitement was already fading. Which was fine with me. Life has a way of returning to normal faster than people expect. By Monday morning, I was back in my office reviewing housing applications and veteran assistance requests. Exactly where I wanted to be. The photograph continued circulating online. Friends sent messages. Former colleagues reached out. A few local news organizations requested interviews. I politely declined most of them. Recognition was nice, but attention had never been my goal. Around lunchtime, my phone rang again. Mom. This time I answered. "Hi, Mom." The relief in her voice was immediate. "Oh, thank goodness." I smiled despite myself. "Everything okay? Your father has been trying to talk to you all weekend." There was something almost amusing about that statement. For years, getting my father interested in my work required an act of Congress. Now he apparently couldn't stop calling. "How's Dad?" Mom hesitated. "Embarrassed." That answer surprised me. I expected curiosity, maybe excitement. Embarrassment hadn't crossed my mind. "Why embarrassed?" Another pause. Then she laughed softly. "Because half the town has seen the picture." Now I understood. Small-town Pennsylvania has a unique relationship with local success. People notice things. They talk. They connect dots. Apparently, several neighbors had recognized me. Former classmates had shared articles. Veteran organizations had reposted the story. The photo had traveled much farther than anyone expected, including my father. Mom continued, "He didn't realize how important your work was." I looked out the office window. Mom, the work was always important. The silence that followed told me she understood exactly what I meant. Finally, she said, "I know." Then came the sentence I had been expecting. "We need to talk. Not just Mom, the family." Dad wanted to see me. Jason wanted to see me. Everyone suddenly wanted a conversation. I leaned back in my chair. Funny how interest arrives once recognition does. Mom must have sensed my hesitation, because her voice softened. "I know how this looks." That honesty caught me off guard. "I really do." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since the ceremony. Would Dad be calling if there wasn't a photograph? Mom didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything. Not because the answer was yes, because she didn't know. That uncertainty hurt more. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The office around me continued moving. Phones ringing, conversations happening, life carrying on. But my thoughts stayed fixed on one question. Did my family miss me? Or did they miss being connected to someone other people suddenly admired? The difference felt important. And I wasn't sure I knew the answer. A few days later, Jason called. I almost ignored it. Almost. But curiosity won. "Hey, Sarah." His voice sounded unusually careful. That alone was suspicious. Jason had never been careful with me. "What's up?" He cleared his throat. "So," I waited. "I saw the article." There it was. Not hello. Not how are you. The article. The photograph. The recognition. I listened quietly. Jason continued. "My business partners were talking about you." I couldn't help smiling. Of course they were. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, my military career generated almost no interest from him. Now his business associates were impressed. Suddenly I mattered. "That's nice." He laughed awkwardly, then said something that surprised me. "I'm proud of you." I believed he meant it, at least partially. The problem was timing. Pride that arrives after public recognition always feels different from pride that exists beforehand. Neither of us mentioned that. Instead, we talked for a few minutes about ordinary things: weather, work, Mom and Dad. The conversation felt strangely unfamiliar, like two people learning how to speak honestly after years of avoiding it. Before hanging up, Jason said, "Dad really wants to see you." I wasn't surprised. "What about you? What about me?" "Do you want to see me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. A long pause followed. Then, "Yeah." For the first time, the answer sounded genuine. Not because of the photograph. Because of the pause. Real answers often take longer. That weekend, I made a decision. I would visit. Not because my family suddenly approved of me. Not because they finally understood my career. And certainly not because of one photograph. I would go because relationships deserve opportunities to grow. Even damaged ones. But I wasn't going to show up the way they expected. I wasn't bringing newspaper articles. I wasn't bringing awards. I wasn't bringing proof of success. I was bringing something much more important. Someone who could tell my family what 22 years of service actually looked like. Someone whose life had been changed by work they never bothered to understand. And if that conversation was going to happen, I wanted them to hear it from someone other than me. So I made a phone call. And when the person answered, I smiled. "Michael," I said, "how would you feel about taking a road trip with me?" Michael Torres laughed before I even finished asking. "A road trip? Pennsylvania. That sounds dangerous already." I smiled. "Probably." Michael had a gift for making serious conversations feel lighter. Maybe that was one reason we'd gotten along so well over the years. I first met him 6 years earlier. At the time, he was in bad shape. Not physically, at least not anymore. The physical injuries had healed as much as they were going to. The deeper wounds were harder to see. Michael had served 2 combat tours overseas. A roadside explosion had left him with permanent injuries and ended the military career he loved. When we met, he was struggling. His marriage was hanging by a thread. Bills were piling up. He was battling depression. And he had reached the point where asking for help felt harder than suffering alone. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of veterans find themselves, proud enough to endure almost anything, proud enough to refuse help until they're drowning. Our organization stepped in. Housing assistance, counseling resources, employment support, family services. Nothing magical, just people showing up consistently. Over time, things improved. Michael rebuilt his life. His marriage survived. His children stayed in his life. He found meaningful work helping other veterans navigate the same challenges. Most importantly, he found purpose again. That was the real victory, not recovery. Purpose. When I explained the situation with my family, Michael listened quietly. Then he said something that made me laugh. So basically, your parents ignored 22 years of service until they saw a fancy photograph. That's a pretty accurate summary. And now they want to talk. Yes. Human beings are weird? I couldn't argue with that. By Saturday morning, we were heading north together. The drive took several hours. Long enough to talk about everything except the reason we were making the trip. Sports, families, old army stories, traffic, the weather. Anything but what waited at the end of the journey. Eventually, though, the conversation circled back. Michael looked out the passenger window. You nervous? A little. Angry? I thought about it. No. That surprised me, because a few months earlier I probably would have answered differently. The ceremony had changed something. Not because of the president, not because of the recognition, because it forced me to stop measuring my worth through my family's attention. Once that happened, the anger started losing its grip. By early afternoon, we pulled into my parents' driveway. Mom opened the front door before we even reached the porch. She hugged me tightly, longer than usual. Then she noticed Michael. For a moment, she looked confused, then curious. Mom, this is Michael Torres. Michael offered his hand. It's nice to meet you. Mom smiled warmly. You too. Inside, Dad and Jason were waiting. The atmosphere felt awkward immediately. Not hostile, just uncertain. Everyone knew this meeting mattered. Nobody knew exactly how it would unfold. Dad stood first. For a second, I saw him studying Michael, trying to figure out who he was, why he was here. Finally, he looked at me. Who's your friend? I glanced toward Michael, then back to my father. Someone I wanted you to meet. We all sat down in the living room. Coffee was served. Small talk happened. The usual dance families perform when they're avoiding the real conversation. Eventually, Dad brought up the photograph. Of course he did. I've had people calling me all week. I smiled politely. I imagine so. He shifted in his chair. I didn't realize how important all this was. There it was, the sentence I'd been expecting. Not because it was enough, because it was honest. At least partially. Before I could respond, Michael spoke. Can I ask a question? Everyone turned toward him. Dad nodded. Sure. Michael leaned forward slightly. Before the picture came out, what did you think Sarah did? The room became quiet. Very quiet. Dad looked uncomfortable immediately. Jason looked interested. Mom looked nervous. Finally, Dad answered. I knew she worked with veterans. Michael nodded. That's all? Dad hesitated. Then, pretty much. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Michael smiled. Not unkindly. Just thoughtfully. I figured. Dad frowned slightly. What do you mean? Michael took a slow breath, then began telling his story. Not dramatically, not like a speech. Just one man describing his life. He talked about the explosion, the injuries, the depression, the nights he couldn't sleep, the strain on his marriage, the fear that his family was slipping away. Then he described meeting Sarah, not as a hero, not as a savior, as someone who kept showing up, again and again, helping, listening, connecting him with resources, refusing to give up on him, even when he had nearly given up on himself. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. By the time Michael finished, the room felt completely different. The photograph no longer mattered. The president no longer mattered. The articles didn't matter. Only the story mattered. Only the life behind the story. Michael looked directly at my father and said the sentence that changed everything. If your daughter hadn't stepped in when she did, his voice softened. I honestly don't know if I'd still be here. Silence. Complete silence. I watched my father's face. Watched the realization settle in. Slowly. Painfully. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hearing about rank, or medals, or recognition. He was hearing about impact. The kind that never appears in photographs. And for the first time, I think he finally understood that my life's work wasn't something that happened beside the president. It happened beside people like Michael. After Michael finished speaking, nobody said much for a while. The room didn't need more words. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly and then simply sits there waiting for everyone to catch up. My father stared down into his coffee cup. My mother wiped at her eyes. Jason leaned back on the couch, unusually silent. For most of my life, family conversations had followed familiar patterns. Dad talked. Jason joked. Mom smoothed things over. I listened. This time, nobody seemed interested in following the script. Eventually, Mom stood and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned carrying an old photo album. I recognized it immediately. One of several albums she'd kept from my military years. She placed it on the coffee table. Nobody opened it right away. Then Dad slowly reached for it. The first page contained photographs from officer candidate school. I was 23. Young. Determined. Probably a little too serious. Dad studied the photograph longer than I expected. Then he turned another page. Training exercises. Deployments. Promotion ceremonies. Years passing one picture at a time. The strange thing about photographs is that they compress entire chapters of life into single moments. You forget how much happened between them. The sacrifices. The missed holidays. The distance. The loneliness. The ordinary days nobody photographs. Dad flipped through page after page. Occasionally stopping. Occasionally shaking his head. As if he were discovering something that had been sitting in front of him all along. Finally, he looked up. I don't remember seeing some of these. I smiled softly. You did. His eyebrows rose. When Mom mailed copies. Mom nodded from across the room. I did. Dad looked genuinely confused. I don't remember. Nobody responded. Because there wasn't much to say. Memory tends to keep what we value. That realization seemed to hit him pretty hard. A little later, Michael and I helped Mom clear lunch dishes. While we worked in the kitchen, I could hear Dad and Jason talking quietly in the living room. The conversation sounded serious, different. When we returned, Jason surprised me. He was holding one of the photographs, a picture from Afghanistan. I remembered the day immediately. Dust, heat, a temporary operations center, long hours, long months. Jason looked at the image, then looked at me. Were you scared? The question caught me off guard, not because of what he asked, because he'd never asked before. I considered the answer carefully. Sometimes. Really? I laughed softly. Jason, everybody's scared sometimes. He stared at the photo again. I never thought about it. That sentence summarized a lot of our relationship. Not cruelty. Not indifference. Just absence of thought. People rarely appreciate sacrifices they never bothered to imagine. The afternoon stretched on. Stories emerged naturally. Not just mine. Michael shared stories about veterans rebuilding their lives. Families staying together despite enormous challenges. People finding purpose after devastating losses. The common theme wasn't heroism. It was resilience. Ordinary people continuing to move forward. Eventually, Dad asked Michael a question. Why do you still talk to Sarah? Michael looked surprised. What do you mean? Dad shrugged awkwardly. I mean, it's been years. Michael smiled. Because she stayed. Nobody said anything. He continued. A lot of people help when it's easy. He glanced toward me. She helped when it wasn't. Again, silence. The older I get, the more I realize that silence often contains more truth than speeches. Late in the afternoon, Michael stepped outside to take a phone call. That left me alone with my family. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. Dad leaned forward. For several seconds, he searched for words. Finally, he found them. I spent years measuring success by the wrong things. The sentence sounded familiar, as though he'd been rehearsing it. Maybe he had. I waited. He continued. I looked at income. A pause. Titles. Another pause. Appearances. His eyes moved toward Jason, then back to me. And I missed what actually mattered. Nobody interrupted. Not even Jason. For perhaps the first time in his life, Dad was speaking without trying to defend himself. That mattered. A lot. Then he asked me something unexpected. Were you angry when I wouldn't come to the ceremony? I thought about that carefully. The truthful answer surprised even me. No. His eyebrows lifted. No. I was disappointed. That landed harder. Because disappointment implies expectation. And expectation implies hope. I continued. I stopped expecting approval years ago. The room remained silent. But I still hoped you'd want to be there. Dad closed his eyes briefly. Not dramatically. Just long enough to absorb it. When he opened them again, they looked different somehow. Older, sadder, more honest. I should have been. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I said something I'd been carrying for years. I didn't need you to understand every part of my career. Dad listened carefully. I just needed you to care. The sentence hung in the room. Simple. Direct. True. My father's eyes filled. Not completely. Just enough. The way older men sometimes cry when they're trying not to. I do care. His voice cracked slightly. I just figured that out too late. I shook my head. No. He looked confused. No. I smiled. You're figuring it out now. That distinction mattered. Because regret looks backward. Growth looks forward. And what I wanted wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even validation. It was understanding. For the first time in a very long time, I thought we might actually be moving toward it. A few weeks after my visit to Pennsylvania, my father called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not because he'd seen an article. Not because someone in town had mentioned my name. Not because of a photograph. Just because he wanted to talk. The difference might sound small. It wasn't. For years, most of our conversations had revolved around logistics. Holiday plans, family updates, weather, sports, safe topics. Now we were slowly learning how to have actual conversations. The kind that should have happened a long time ago. That particular afternoon, Dad called to tell me he'd signed up to attend a veterans community event. At first, I thought I had misheard him. You did what? He laughed. I knew you'd react like that. I smiled. Since when do you go to veterans events? Since I realized there are things I should have paid attention to years ago. That answer stayed with me. Because it was exactly the kind of statement my father never would have made in the past. A month later, he came to Virginia. Not for a ceremony, not for publicity. Just for a Saturday event hosted by our nonprofit. There were no cameras, no politicians, no important guests, just veterans, families, volunteers, and community members gathering to support one another. Honestly, it was one of my favorite kinds of events. Because nobody was there to impress anyone. People showed up because they cared. I spotted my parents almost immediately after they arrived. Mom looked excited. Dad looked nervous, which strangely enough made me happy. It meant the event mattered to him. Throughout the morning, I watched him quietly observe. He listened to veterans tell stories. He spoke with military spouses. He met parents whose children had returned home carrying invisible wounds. Most importantly, he listened. Really listened. At one point, I saw him sitting beside an elderly Vietnam veteran for nearly half an hour. The two men talked quietly while drinking coffee. Neither seemed in any hurry to leave. Later, I asked Dad what they discussed. His answer was simple. Life. The older I get, the more I appreciate simple answers. Around lunchtime, a display board was set up near the main hall. It featured photographs from various programs and events over the years. Veterans finding housing, families attending support programs, community projects, volunteer efforts, and there it was, the photograph. The one that had changed everything, me standing beside the president. Several people stopped to look at it throughout the day. Some took pictures, others pointed. A few asked questions. Months earlier, that photograph had impressed my father. Months earlier, it was all he could talk about. Now something different happened. Dad stood in front of it for a long time, not speaking, just looking. Eventually, I walked over. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Dad smiled. You know what's funny? What? I thought this picture was important. I looked at the photograph, then back at him. And now, his eyes drifted toward the event around us. Toward the veterans, toward the families, toward the people laughing and talking nearby. Then he answered, Now I realize it's the least important part. I felt my throat tighten slightly. Not because of the photograph. Because I finally understood what he meant. The picture had never been the story. The story was everything behind it. The years, the sacrifices, the people helped along the way, the lives touched, the families rebuilt, the veterans who found hope again. A photograph simply happened to capture one tiny moment. The real work happened everywhere else. Dad continued looking around the room. Then he said something I'll never forget. For years I thought success was being admired. I smiled. The old version of him absolutely believed that. Recognition, status, visibility. Those were the measurements he understood. Then he looked directly at me. What do you think success is? I thought about all the people I'd met over the years. Veterans rebuilding lives, military spouses holding families together, volunteers showing up without recognition, people helping others simply because help was needed. Then I answered, success is leaving people better than you found them. Dad nodded slowly, as if he wanted to remember every word. Maybe we both did. The truth is, my family didn't transform overnight. Life doesn't work that way. Jason still made mistakes. Dad still had moments when old habits surfaced. I still carried some hurt. Healing isn't a finish line. It's a process, a choice people make repeatedly. But something important had changed. We were finally seeing one another clearly, not through assumptions, not through expectations, not through appearances, through truth. And sometimes that's enough. Looking back now, I don't think the photograph changed my family. I think it created an opportunity. The real change happened afterward. When people chose to listen, when they chose to learn, when they chose to admit they had been wrong, most of all when they chose to care. If there's one lesson I've carried from this experience, it's this. Never assume you understand someone's contribution simply because you can see the surface of their life. Some of the most meaningful work in this world happens quietly, far from applause, far from recognition, far from photographs. And sometimes the people making the biggest difference are the very people we overlook. If this story reminded you of someone who served quietly, sacrificed without recognition, or changed lives behind the scenes, take a moment to tell them what they mean to you. And if you've ever been the person whose efforts went unnoticed, I hope you remember this. Your value was never dependent on who recognized it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If stories about family resilience, forgiveness, and second chances speak to you, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts below and joined us for more stories in the future. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of the people who quietly carry more than anyone realizes.